As you very well may already know, the GTX 1660 is a 1080p 60 FPS gaming monster. It's also a pretty respectable 1440p 60 FPS card as well. The gameplay footage you're seeing right now was captured on my gaming/work computer, which has the GTX 1660 paired with an AMD Ryzen 7 2700X CPU. With this combo, I'm getting at least 60 FPS or higher in every game I'm showing here. And yes, every game is running on the highest graphic preset option in that game. That is, except for Ghost Recon Wildlands and Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which I had to turn down one notch to get them to consistently run above 60 FPS. On max settings, they both ran close to 60 FPS, but would drop into the 50s a fair amount as well. Now, most people that benchmark and review graphics cards do their testing using high-end CPUs. The reason they do this is because they're trying to show the maximum performance the graphics card they're testing is capable of. When running an application like a game, the CPU and GPU work together. The CPU has stuff it has to process like user input, in-game AI, sound, and other things. It then sends that information to the GPU for it to process and then render. This is of course all happening very, very quickly. The faster or more powerful your CPU is, the quicker it sends information to your graphics card for it to render and then send to your monitor, which then makes your in-game FPS go up. Eventually, you will reach the limits of what your GPU can do. If you take a look at the statistics at the top left of the screen, you can see that the first line is the GPU statistics. The number you want to look at is the utilization percentage. Notice how it's in the high 90s? This means we're pretty much at the limits of what this GPU can do. Now I want you to look down a couple lines at the CPU utilization. See how it's only at around 20 to 30% utilization most of the time? This means my Ryzen 7 2700X is processing its stuff and sending it to the GTX 1660 more than fast enough to run the GPU to its maximum. And this is what you want. When you're spending $200+ on a graphics card, you want to get the maximum performance from your GPU that it's capable of. Running a graphics card with a high-end CPU is great for determining its maximum performance capability. However, in real life, I feel that most people shopping for graphics cards in the price range of stuff like the GTX 1660 are not necessarily using computers with higher-end CPUs in them. I could be wrong about this, but generally speaking, I feel people shopping in this price range are using older systems or systems with mid to lower tier CPUs, and the question that comes to my mind is, how does the GTX 1660 perform at 1080p with an older, lower end CPU? It just so happens that I have a system I built a number of years ago which uses a 7-year-old AMD A10 5800K APU. This is an AMD FX era APU. It's a quad core with a base clock of 3.8 GHz and a 4.2 GHz boost clock. When you compare those numbers to modern CPUs, it doesn't really sound that bad. But the truth of the matter is, it's in the same performance category as CPUs that are listed as the minimum specs required to run many modern games. I think there may be more than one person out there that's using a similarly powered CPU and is wondering what the performance of the GTX 1660 will be like with their system. Well, that's what I want to find out. Let's pair these guys up and see what happens. What I'm going to do here is play 6 different fairly recent games. I'm going to run each game at 1080p at the same settings I was able to achieve a constant 60 FPS and above when paired with my Ryzen 7 2700X. This will give us a good benchmark to see just how much a older, slower CPU affects the performance of the GTX 1660. The reason I'm running these games at 1080p and not at 1440p or 4K is because there's no reason to. Most monitors with that high of resolution cost more than the GTX 1660. And I just don't see that many gamers spending more money on their monitor than their graphics card. Not to mention, according to the August 2019 Steam hardware survey, which is the most recent survey as of the time I'm sitting writing this video, about 90% of people on Steam are playing at resolutions of 1080p or below. So someone buying a GTX 1660 is most likely going to be using it with a 1080p or lower resolution monitor. Like I already mentioned, the system I'm testing on is running an AMD A10 5800K APU with 16 gigabytes of DDR3 clocked at 1600 megahertz. I ran all my tests using the most current Nvidia drivers which were available at the time, which is driver version 431.60. The first game I tested is the ever popular Fortnite. With the graphical settings on Epic, in the early portions of the game, the frame rate is pretty high, averaging around 80 FPS or thereabouts. As the game progresses and we reach the end of the match, however, and there are more players in close proximity to each other, our frame rate drops into the 40s and 50s. Now let's compare that with what we were getting when I paired the 1660 with my Ryzen 7 2700X. At the beginning of the match, we're getting well over 100 FPS. By the end, the frame rate has dropped, but it's still in the 80s and 90s. The major difference you'll notice besides the frame rate is the GPU and CPU utilization percentages. When paired with the much more powerful 2700X, our GPU utilization is in the high 90s, which means the GPU is pretty much outputting the maximum frame rate it can at the graphical settings I have the game set to. On the A10 system, however, notice how our GPU utilization is much lower, and our CPU utilization is much higher, at times even reaching 100%. This is what is known as CPU bottlenecking. The CPU is maxed out with the amount of work it has to do and can't send the data to the GPU fast enough for the GPU to also run at 100%. So what's happening is the GPU is sitting idle for fractions of a second at a time rather than working constantly because it's being limited, aka bottlenecked, by the CPU. The next game I tested out is Doom from 2016. Yeah, it's a good 3 years old now, but it's still a great looking game and is a whole lot of fun to play. I had to run my tests in the OpenGL 4.5 API rather than Vulcan because my A10 system would crash immediately upon launching the game in Vulcan. I'm not entirely sure what's going on there. In Doom, we're seeing the same problem we had in Fortnite. Although we are getting over 60 FPS, even in action-packed scenes like this one with lots of enemies on screen and stuff, looking at our CPU and GPU utilization, we're nowhere near what the GTX 1660 can do. Most of the time in Doom, it's below 50% utilization, and our CPU is maxed out. Switching over to my 2700X system, I thought I knew how things were going to go, but the numbers are actually kind of interesting. Using OpenGL 4.5, GPU utilization did go up, but not to 100%. Assuming MSI Afterburner and RevoTuner are reporting accurate numbers, we were only seeing GPU utilization of 50 and 60%. This did lead to a higher frame rate in the 80s and 90s most of the time, but that's still not the best the GTX 1660 can do. I really wish my A10 5800K wouldn't crash when I tried running Doom using the Vulcan API because I'm very interested in seeing just what that system's performance is like using Vulcan. I'm not sure what's going on with the 1660 and OpenGL 4.5 because using the Vulcan API with my Ryzen 7 2700X, GPU utilization shot up into the high 90s and the game was running at well over 100 FPS. In Ghost Recon Wildlands, on the very high preset, the A10 5800K was pegged at 100% utilization the entire time. And the GPU was once again operating well below its full capability. GPU utilization ranged from 40-ish% up into the 60s, but I would say averaged around 50%, which netted a frame rate that averaged around 30 FPS. When paired with my Ryzen 7 2700X at the same settings, GPU utilization jumped up to right near 100%, and we were able to easily hit our goal of 60 plus FPS at all times. Okay, there were a few moments where it dropped into the 50s, but then quickly came back. So, yeah. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was one of the games that the 1660 was able to flex its muscles the most with when paired with the A10 5800K. At the high preset, CPU utilization was pegged at 100% once again, but GPU utilization wasn't always terrible. Most of the time, it hovered in the 70s and 80s with occasional peaks in the 90s. Just like the other games I've tested so far, when I paired the 1660 with my Ryzen 7 2700X, we were able to max it out and get a constant 60 FPS and higher. The next game tested was The Division. When paired with my A10, even on ultra settings, we actually got decent performance when looking at the numbers. GPU utilization was up in the 80s most of the time, which gave us a nice frame rate well above 60 FPS. The CPU is still pegged at 100%, but GPU utilization and our frame rate is looking pretty good. But these numbers don't tell the whole story. The problem I had was there was terrible input lag. None of the other games I tested had this problem at all. The Division is the only game it would do this to me on. Everything would start off fine, but after a little bit, I would press to move a certain direction or press a button to use a special ability, and my character would continue for a good 2 seconds or so doing what he had been doing as if I hadn't pressed anything. After a couple seconds, he would do what I had pressed, which was super annoying, making the game pretty much unplayable. If I sat still for a while and there were no enemies on screen, it would recover for a little bit, but as soon as I would play a little bit or encounter some enemies, the input lag would return, and it was just a horrible gaming experience. Now, I know that the CPU handles user input, so it makes me wonder if it being pegged at 100% was the main contributor to the lag. The only thing is, the other games I tested also had the CPU pegged at 100%, and they controlled just fine. The Division is an Ubisoft game, and Ubisoft games are notorious for being a little buggy, so yeah. Using my 2700X on the Ultra preset, the game ran great. The GPU was running at its maximum at a consistent 60 plus FPS, and best of all, there was zero input lag. The final game I'm featuring in this video is FarCry 5. On Ultra settings, according to our Afterburner and Riva Tuner statistics, the A10 5800K never reached 100% utilization, which you would think is good. But our GPU utilization never maxed out either. It was mostly in the 50s and 60s, which got us a frame rate in the 30s and 40s. Switching to the 2700X, no surprise, GPU utilization was maxed out, and we were able to easily maintain a frame rate well above 60 FPS. So the moral of the story is this. While the GTX 1660 is a 1080p 60 FPS beast and will work with an older CPU like my A10 5800K, you're not going to get your full $220+ worth out of it when pairing it with an older, slower CPU like that. In most cases, you're only going to get $110 to $150-ish worth of performance out of it. So in my opinion, spending the money on a GTX 1660, if you're going to pair it with an old i3 or an AMD FX quad-core or something even less powerful than those, it just isn't worth it. If you're running an FX 6100 or an older i5 or higher, then I think you'll be good. I can't speak definitively to that, seeing as I don't have that hardware to test, but based off of information I've found on YouTube and other outlets on the internet, I feel pretty confident with that conclusion. Do you already own a GTX 1660? Or are you looking to buy one to increase the performance of your rig? Sound off in the comments. Share your system specs and let me know what kind of performance you are getting. Also, I'd like to get your opinion about this video. Do you like this type of graphics card review, or do you prefer the typical bar charts kind? If you have questions for me, post them in the comments as well, and I'll do my best to answer them there. If you enjoyed this video, please click the thumbs up button before you head out, share it with your friends, and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more videos from me. If you enjoy what I do here and would like to help support the channel, you can check out my Amazon store at the link in the video description, where you can pick yourself up a GTX 1660 like this one, or any of the other cool products I feature in my videos. Thanks so much for watching. I hope that you have a fantastic day, and I look forward to seeing you again in another video. Later.